The Quonset hut stood alone in the frozen landscape, its curved metal walls rattling softly as the wind pressed against them. Snow piled high along the sides, sealing the structure into the ground like it had always belonged there. Inside, the air was cold enough to make every breath visible. They had survived worse winters, but this one arrived early and without mercy. The firewood stack near the stove was shrinking faster than expected. Each log burned was a quiet reminder that they had miscalculated. There was no forest nearby anymore, and hauling wood through deep snow was nearly impossible. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was becoming dangerous. They checked the woodpile again, hoping somehow it had grown overnight. It hadn't. Worse, the remaining logs were damp, darkened by weeks of snow melt and freezing rain. Wet firewood meant weak flames, heavy smoke, and wasted heat. The stove struggled, and so did they. Nights became longer, colder, and restless. They discussed rationing heat, burning smaller fires, even dismantling old furniture if it came to that. None of those options felt sustainable. Something had to change, and soon. While clearing snow near the back of the hut, one of them paused. Beneath the drifting white surface was a subtle rise in the ground, a shape that didn't belong to nature. That's when they remembered it. Years ago, before the hut was reinforced for winter, they had dug a small underground shed. At the time, it was meant for tools and emergency storage. Over time, it had been forgotten, buried under seasons of snow and silence. If it was still there, it might hold more than just old tools. They grabbed shovels and began digging where the ground felt unnaturally firm. Snow gave way to ice, and ice gave way to frozen soil. Every strike echoed in the quiet winter air. After hours of work, a wooden hatch appeared beneath the snow, its surface weathered but intact. They cleared it carefully, brushing away ice and frost. When the hatch finally opened, a rush of cold air escaped, but it wasn't damp. It was dry. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness below. Stacked neatly along the underground walls were logs. Old, but preserved. Dry. Solid. Usable. They pulled one out and split on the surface. The wood cracked cleanly, no moisture inside. It was exactly what they needed. That night, the fire burned stronger than it had in weeks. The hut warmed slowly, steadily, and for the first time in days, they slept without fear of the cold. The underground shed wasn't just storage anymore. It was the reason they could stay. The next morning, they returned to the underground shed with a clear purpose. Finding the firewood had been luck, but relying on luck wouldn't get them through the rest of winter. They widened the entrance, reinforcing the hatch with thicker planks to prevent snow from collapsing inward. The walls were brushed clean, revealing packed earth that had stayed dry thanks to the depth and insulation. They realized the shed had maintained a stable temperature all these years. Cold, yes, but never freezing enough to trap moisture. It was the perfect place to store firewood. For the next 2 days, they worked non-stop. Every usable log from the surface was carried underground, stacked carefully to allow air circulation. What wood was left near the stove to dry slowly, then moved below once it was ready. Nothing went to waste. The routine was exhausting but reassuring. Each trip into the shed felt like an investment in survival. By the end of the second day, the underground space was half full, enough to last weeks, maybe longer if they were careful. That night, the storm arrived without warning. Wind howled across the metal shell of the Quonset hut, shaking it hard enough to make the bolts creak. Snow fell sideways, piling up faster than they could have imagined. The door was sealed shut by morning. Inside, the fire burned steadily. The wood caught easily, producing clean flames and solid heat. They listened to the storm in silence, knowing that without the underground shed, this night would have been a disaster. When the storm passed, the world outside was unrecognizable. Snow buried everything, paths, markers, even parts of the hut itself. The underground shed, however, was untouched, dry, reliable. They began to understand something important. Survival wasn't just about strength or endurance. It was about planning ahead and working with the environment instead of fighting it. The ground had protected the firewood better than any structure above it ever could. From that point on, the The underground shed became central to their winter plan. Firewood, tools, and emergency supplies were all stored below ground. They adjusted their daily routine around it, checking the hatch every morning, clearing snow before it could build up. The Quonset hut was still cold, still isolated, but now it was manageable. Winter was no longer an enemy waiting to win. It was a challenge they were finally prepared for. As the weeks passed, their food supplies began to reflect the length of the winter. Canned meals were counted carefully, and nothing was opened without a reason. Cooking became more efficient. Meals were planned around the fire schedule, never letting heat go to waste. The stove was no longer just for warmth. It was the center of daily survival. Each log pulled from the underground shed represented time gained. Time to plan, time to wait, and time was everything. The Quonset hut showed signs of wear under constant snow and wind. Small gaps appeared near the base where cold air crept inside. Using tools stored in the underground shed, they sealed the weak points with salvaged insulation and scrap metal. The difference was immediate. The hut held heat longer, and the firewood lasted further into the night. Even small improvements felt like major victories. They learned that survival often came down to details no one else would notice. After several storms in a row, the world fell quiet. No wind, no snowfall, just endless white stretching beyond the hut. The silence was unsettling. Without movement or sound, time seemed slower, heavier. They checked the underground shed daily, more out of routine than necessity. Everything remained dry, stable, dependable. That consistency grounded them when the outside world felt frozen in place. One evening, as the fire crackled steadily, they talked about the future. Not just surviving this winter, but the next ones too. They discussed expanding the underground shed, digging deeper sections for food storage and water protection. The ground had proven itself reliable. What started as an emergency solution had become a long-term strategy. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were adapting. By midwinter, the Quonset hut was no longer the same place it had been at the start of the season. It had evolved alongside them. The underground shed was now essential, a hidden extension of their home, invisible from the surface, but critical to their survival. The cold was still there. The isolation hadn't changed, but their confidence had. They knew now that as long as the firewood stayed dry below ground, they could endure whatever winter brought next. The temperature dropped sharply without warning. Mornings became painful, and even inside the hut, the cold clung to every surface. They increased the fire slightly, careful not to burn through their supply too quickly. Each log from the underground shed was chosen with intention. The firewood continued to perform exactly as it should, dry, efficient, dependable. Without it, this week would have broken them. Instead, they endured. Heavy snowfall threatened to bury the shed's hatch completely. One morning, they found it nearly invisible beneath a thick layer of snow. They built a simple raised marker and wind barrier using scrap wood and metal. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Now, even after a storm, the entrance remained easy to find. Access to the shed was no longer a concern. The underground space was officially secure. With the fire burning steadily each night, their bodies finally began to recover. Sleep came easier. Movements were less stiff. Routine returned. Wake up, clear snow, check the shed, prepare food, maintain the fire. That rhythm gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together. The underground shed wasn't just storing firewood, it was supporting their mental endurance. Stability mattered as much as warmth. Another storm rolled in, slower but heavier than the rest. Snow fell continuously for nearly 2 days. They stayed inside, conserving energy. The fire burned low but steady, fed by dry logs pulled from below ground. When the storm finally ended, the Quonset hut stood firm. No damage, no panic, no loss of control. The system worked. Standing outside after the storm, they looked at the snow-covered ground and knew what lay beneath it. The underground shed wasn't visible, but its impact was undeniable. It had transformed their situation completely. What once felt like isolation now felt like independence. They trusted the shelter. They trusted the ground. and they trusted that they could last until winter released its grip. The days slowly began to feel different. The cold was still present, but the air carried a subtle shift. Snow no longer fell every night. Some mornings, the sky opened briefly, letting pale light touch the frozen ground. They noticed it in small ways: softer ice near the door, longer hours of daylight, quieter winds. Winter wasn't over, but it was loosening its hold. They took inventory of the firewood stored underground. The stacks were lower now, but still steady. Careful planning had paid off. No logs were wasted, and every fire served a purpose. They adjusted the burn schedule again, using less wood during the day and saving heat for the long nights. The underground shed had carried them through the worst part. Now it just needed to last a little longer. With the possibility of thaw ahead, they began thinking about moisture. Melting snow could undo everything if they weren't careful. They reinforced drainage paths around the shed entrance, guiding water away from the hatch. Small trenches were carved into the ice and soil. The goal was simple: keep the underground space dry, no matter what the weather decided to do next. Experience had taught them that prevention was easier than repair. There was no celebration, no dramatic moment of relief, just a calm sense of confidence. They moved through their routines without urgency now. The fear that had followed them at the start of winter was gone. The Quonset hut felt solid. The underground shed felt permanent. They had built something reliable, something that worked when everything else was uncertain. On one clear morning, they stood outside and listened. Snow dripped slowly from the edges of the hut. The fire inside burned low, steady, and controlled. There was enough wood left below ground to finish the season. Spring would come when it was ready. Until then, they would wait, warm, prepared, and protected by what they had built beneath the frozen earth. The snow began to change texture. What once crunched underfoot now softened, sinking slightly with each step. Thin streams of water appeared around the base of the hut, tracing paths toward lower ground. The temperature hovered just above freezing during the day, then dropped again at night. They monitored the underground shed closely. The drainage channels held, guiding meltwater away from the hatch. So far, everything stayed dry. The weather became unpredictable. Cold nights returned without warning, followed by warmer afternoons. They adjusted their fire use again, lighting smaller fires more frequently instead of long burns. Dry firewood made this possible. Inside the hut, condensation became a new concern. They increased ventilation during the warmest hours to prevent moisture buildup. Winter was changing shape, but it still demanded attention. They descended into the underground shed more often now, inspecting walls, floor, and stack supplies. The earth remained firm. No seepage, no rot, no damage. What surprised them most was how calm the space felt, insulated from the chaos happening above ground. The shed had become more than storage. It felt like the most stable part of their shelter. One evening, they sat near the stove and talked about improvements. Better insulation, a second underground section, a covered access tunnel. Survival had given way to planning. They realized the underground shed could support not just firewood, but long-term living in harsh conditions. What started as necessity was turning into design. By the time the snow began to retreat for good, they knew they had made it through the worst. The Quonset hut showed scars from the winter, but it still stood strong. The underground shed had done exactly what it was meant to do. They hadn't just endured the season, they had learned from it. And when the ground finally thawed completely, they were already thinking about how to prepare for the next winter. Large patches of ground began to reappear around the hut. Mud replaced ice, and the air smelled different, damp, earthy, alive. They stepped carefully, avoiding areas where the thaw made footing unstable. The landscape no longer felt frozen in time. Inside the Quonset hut, the fire burned only when needed now. Daytime warmth was slowly returning. The underground shed remained unchanged, cool, dry, dependable. They reviewed everything that had carried them through the winter. The stove placement, the insulation fixes, the firewood management. But above all, the underground shed stood out as the single most important decision they had ever made. Without it, the outcome would have been very different. They marked notes in a small journal, knowing these lessons would matter again. With the ground soft enough to work, they repaired areas around the hut that had been inaccessible all winter. Snow damage was patched. Loose panels were secured. Drainage paths were reshaped and reinforced. The work felt lighter now, done without gloves, without frozen fingers. Every improvement was made with the next winter already in mind. One afternoon, they stood near the shed entrance and imagined extending it further underground. A second chamber, better shelving, a reinforced ceiling. The idea no longer felt extreme or risky. It felt practical. The ground had proven its value, and they trusted it completely. As spring settled in, the Quonset hut felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a permanent home. The underground shed remained hidden, silent, and essential, a reminder that the most important structures didn't always show themselves. They had learned to survive by building downward, not outward, and that lesson would stay with them long after the last snow disappeared. With no immediate threats from the cold, their days lost the urgency that had defined the winter months. They worked at a calmer pace, stopping when tired instead of pushing through exhaustion. The pressure to constantly prepare for the next storm was gone. The underground shed still held supplies, but now it felt like security rather than necessity. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to slow down. They noticed how little firewood they were burning now. Some days, the stove remained cold until evening. Instead of worrying, they trusted what they had built. The shed had proven itself again and again. Efficiency replaced fear. Planning replaced reaction. They understood now that survival didn't always require constant effort. Sometimes it required restraint. Visitors would never guess how much of their life existed underground. From the surface, the Quonset hut looked simple, almost fragile. But beneath it was structure, planning, and resilience. The underground shed represented everything they had learned. Protect what matters, hide it from harm, and let the earth do its work. What was hidden had saved them. They talked briefly about leaving once the weather fully improved, about returning to easier conditions, familiar places. But the thought didn't carry much weight. They had invested too much into this place, not just labor, but understanding. This land had tested them, and in return, taught them. Staying felt like a decision, not a limitation. As spring progressed, the underground shed remained unchanged. Dry, stable, reliable. It no longer symbolized survival alone, but success. They had built a system that endured pressure, time, and uncertainty. And as they stood near the entrance one last time that season, they knew this solution would define how they faced every winter from now on. The air finally warmed enough to feel comfortable without layers. Sunlight reflected off the metal curve of the Quonset hut instead of disappearing into the snow. They kept the door open longer now, letting fresh air move freely inside. The stove sat unused for most of the day. The underground shed remained cool, untouched by the changing season above. It had done its job. They reorganized the shed carefully, removing what wasn't needed and labeling what remained. Firewood was stacked with wider gaps now, preparing space for the next season's supply. Tools were cleaned and hung properly. This wasn't emergency storage anymore. It was infrastructure. Every decision was made with years ahead in mind, not just the next storm. With winter behind them, they experimented with new uses for the underground space. Certain sections were cooler than others, perfect for food storage. Another area stayed dry enough for sensitive equipment. They realized the shed could serve multiple roles depending on the season. The ground offered flexibility they had never considered before. Standing outside in the soft grass that replaced snow, they looked at the hut differently now. What once felt risky and uncertain had become proven and dependable. There was no regret for the hard winter, only respect for what it had forced them to learn. The underground shed was no longer a reminder of struggle, but of growth. As summer approached, they began gathering firewood again, slowly, intentionally. This time, there was no panic, no urgency. Each log was placed underground with care, knowing exactly where it would be when winter returned. They were ready long before the cold ever came back. Summer passed quietly, marked by steady work instead of survival stress. Firewood was cut, split, and carried underground in measure mounts. They no longer rushed. Each task followed a plan refined by experience. The underground shed filled slowly, intentionally, never beyond what could be managed. Preparation had replaced urgency. They made small upgrades throughout the warm months. Stronger supports inside the shed. Better drainage paths around the entrance. Nothing dramatic, just improvements guided by memory. The fear that once drove every decision was gone. In its place was confidence built on proof. They knew exactly what this place could handle. One evening, the temperature dipped unexpectedly. The air sharpened, carrying a familiar edge. They lit the stove without hesitation. The firewood burned clean and strong. There was no anxiety this time, only recognition. Winter would return, but it no longer arrived as a threat. As the first light frost appeared on the ground, they watched from the doorway of the Quonset hut. Everything was ready. The shed was stocked. The structure was sealed. The routine was known. Nothing needed to be explained or proven anymore. The system spoke for itself. Looking out over the land, they understood what had truly saved them. Not just the firewood, not just the shelter. It was the decision to trust the ground beneath their feet, to build with it instead of against it. That choice had changed everything. And when winter came again, they were already waiting, warm, prepared, and unafraid. Years later, the Quonset hut still stood against the wind, its curved metal surface marked by time, but unchanged in purpose. From the outside, it looked simple, almost temporary. No one passing by would suspect how carefully it had been prepared to endure the harshest conditions. Beneath the ground, the underground shed remained exactly as it was designed to be: dry, stable, and quietly reliable. Firewood stacked neatly along the walls, tools in their places, space reserved for the seasons ahead. What once saved them in a moment of desperation became a permanent way of living. They no longer feared winter. They respected it. They understood its patterns, its demands, and its limits. The lesson was never about firewood alone. It was about foresight, about adapting instead of reacting, about trusting the ground when everything above it felt uncertain. The cold still came every year. The snow still fell. But now, none of it caught them unprepared. The solution they found beneath their feet changed everything. And it endured season after season.